Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for your generous introduction. First, I would like to thank Dr. Curtis and Nahid, and sorry I don't know your last name, for inviting me, and especially Astrid for organizing this lecture. So it's a pleasure, and it's great to see some colleagues and friends and mentors in this lecture. So as you can see, I will be talking about Persian gardens, and that was actually the topic of my PhD dissertation, and then I wrote a book on this topic, and I have presented on this topic in different venues. And when I received this invitation from IHF, I thought that I should probably just present something new that I have not discussed in other places. And I will be happy to share some of the findings of my work, my research on the historical material that I explored with you. As you may know, the material that I will be discussing today are all part of a book that I published with IB Tauris a few years ago. So I would like to dedicate this lecture to my mentor, who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. And talking about passion, I think all of my passion for gardens and garden history is because of the opportunity that I had to work with Doug Allen. So normally in the US, when you are teaching classes on landscape or architectural history, you need to start from Earth, because most students need to be educated about the location of some of these early civilizations, and today I will be talking about Persian gardens, and obviously when we talk about Persia, we are talking about the cultural boundaries of Persian civilization, and as you can see here, we had immigrations of Indo-Europeans and the Semitics, and the oldest settlements of the world, some of the oldest settlements are like Çatalhöyük or Hattusis, are located in the area where these two layers of culture, civilization overlap. But talking about this region, obviously Egypt has a long history, and I thought that even though I'm not going to talk about Egyptian gardens today, I thought it's the best probably to start this lecture with an image, an amazing image from a tomb painting from Egypt, which actually depicts a pleasure garden, a royal garden. And as you can see here, and I would say this painting is very progressive, mainly because it includes information that we can rarely even see in 17th century or 18th century garden paintings in other parts of the world. But as you can see here, it shows us that there is a central courtyard, and there is an entrance, there is a building. But what makes this painting unique is that, and again, especially for architects, is that you can see the elevation or the facade of the building, as well as the site plan, but also a section of the building. So all these three layers, and obviously having a section enables the observer to get some information about what is happening within the building inside the garden. But in general, talking about Egypt, most gardens were treated as utilitarian spaces, and the pleasure gardens were kind of limited to the boundaries of the court. So talking about Mesopotamia, this is actually one of the oldest pieces that we have from Assyrian civilization. And as you can see, this is from 1200 BC. and and it shows the god of water standing right in front, in the middle of this space. And as you can see here, this territory is being enclosed by two trees representing a garden. And it's very interesting that if you look at the history of garden design in the Middle East, or so-called the Islamic world, you see that the 17th century gardens, 18th century gardens, the majority of them are designed based on this model. But talking about Mesopotamia, as you know, the only real garden that we have information about is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was described by some Greek writers. And other than that, we don't have much evidence. So we, as garden historians or landscape historians, we have to actually consult with visual material, meaning arts or paintings, or textual material, meaning mythologies, religious texts, and etc. And in case of Mesopotamia, it's very interesting to see that in earlier texts there is no image of a real garden, and then you can see this respect for nature or elements of nature, like flowers, like plants and trees, and then gradually everything is being shaped and formed and developed, and then you have the concept of garden. And when you start kind of comparing what you see here, which is depicting 4 rivers, to the story of Genesis and this story of 4 rivers inside in the story of Genesis, then you can start kind of making some comparison. You see that something is going on even though we don't have access to the real gardens. But the other thing that we can see here is that there is some kind of spiritual value to the garden. So there is this kind of spiritual aspect of the garden that makes it present in these texts and these types of arts. And then it becomes like a model for what we call a 4-fold garden design, or chaharbagh, that is being followed or used throughout the whole region. And I'm going to talk about that later. But then we have the Achaemenid Empire, and it's actually very difficult to talk about Achaemenid Empire when I'm standing in front of Dr. Curtis, both husband and wife. And as it's very interesting that Achaemenids, because it was such a large empire, that the ideas were developed in the whole in their whole empire. So meaning that for the first time, actually, they developed some kind of international taste for art, and especially for architecture. And then ideas actually moved in the Achaemenid Empire from east and west pretty quickly. And we have the Persepolis, and obviously talking about Nowruz, the fact that Persepolis itself was designed to celebrate Nowruz, which also is referring to the significance of the concept of season, the change of seasons, and the nature in Achaemenid so-called philosophy or mindset. But also, what is even more important is that one of the earliest known gardens that we know in Iranian plateau is a garden in the royal garden that belongs to Cyrus the Great in Pasargadae. And as you can see, and Pasargadae was obviously their first capital. And as you can see here, there is a palace or kind of a pavilion for the king, and there are 2 small pavilions that were probably used by the soldiers to control circulation. And then there is this big planted area in the middle of the garden. And there are, even though this is actually one of the drawings that came out of this archaeological work, there have been some speculations about the accuracy of this plan. But we know that there was a garden, it was quite well designed and planned based on a geometric pattern, and that was located in the center of the garden. So now from the Achaemenid age, I'm actually jumping into the 16th century Finn garden in Kashan. And as you can see here, the elements are the same, meaning that we have the planted area, we have a building or pavilion, and we have water channels and the water fountain. And what makes actually these gardens quite interesting places for all of us is that it's not about the form, it's about the experience that you have. It's about a kind of a microclimate that they create. And if, for example, if you are standing outside and the temperature is about 35, 40, surprisingly here in this area it's about 25. So there is a huge difference between the world outside of a garden and the world inside of a garden. And that has to do with the shadows, the shaded areas, the moving water. So it's a very dynamic experience that an observer can have within these gardens. But also, Finn is my own favorite, mainly because the building is kind of merged with garden design. So the building is there, but it's very transparent, it's very light, so and it's not heavy at all. So it's very well kind of connected to the landscape around it. And based on the visual material, meaning the miniature paintings that we have after the 13th century, and many historic accounts and travelers' accounts, we know that many of these buildings were treated as light elements within gardens, so were designed as very light. They were not supposed to be dominant, even though they were designed as a palace for a king. But also the fact that this concept of chaharbagh design or fourfold garden becomes more like a representation of paradise that is being reflected in garden carpets across the region, in Central Asia, in Iran, in Persia, and in other parts of the Islamic world. But also you can see that it's also reflected, in tile design. And here in the center of this paradise garden, you can see that there is this kind of very religious connotation, very strong religious message that is trying to convey here. But this pattern is being kind of transferred into other parts of the Islamic world, like Spain. And by no means I want to generalize. The fact is that not all Persian gardens or so-called Islamic gardens were chaharbagh. So that chaharbagh pattern was a very dynamic plan that changed over time, that kind of adapted itself to the topography and to the geographical conditions of these gardens. But also in areas like Spain or North Africa, you see a kind of a hybrid of elements of gardens that are coming from Rome versus the ones that have to do with the Islamic world or Persian gardens. And that's from west, but from east we have the Mughal Empire. And Babur, who was the founder of Mughal dynasty, whose great-grandfather from the father's side was Timur, and we know that Timur was extremely interested in gardens. He always stayed in his gardens, and Babur, who was kind of quite educated in that sense and very cultural person, continued this tradition and this is actually, Baburnama is such a fabulous text for numerous reasons. But in all my history classes, my landscape history classes, it's a required document. So students should read the whole book, because it makes many references to the use of gardens, to the design of gardens, and that provides a first-hand kind of observation. And we know that Babur himself actually designed gardens, was involved in design. But also in Baburnama, you can see how different parts of these gardens were used, which is very important, because nowadays when we look at some of these gardens, we have no idea how these spaces within these gardens function historically. And as you can see here, Babur is standing there talking to the architect or the designer here. And the designer, if you zoom in, you can see that there is a grid pattern that is in his hands, which shows the dominance of geometry as the whole idea behind a Persian garden design. And as you can see here, it's a chaharbagh, and even in his text, not only in this part, but also in many other parts, he talks about his passion for chaharbagh. So for him, for Babur, a perfect Persian garden was a chaharbagh. But it's very interesting that his successors actually developed this idea, and gradually Mughal gardens were developed based on the conditions of the topography. So they are, in that sense, they are very dynamic places. And this is Humayun's tomb. Humayun was the son of Babur, and as you can see here, his tomb is located right in the center of a chaharbagh, and almost for the first time, and I say almost because I'm going to talk about that later, for the first time, the garden is being seen as a perfect place for a mausoleum, meaning the garden is being seen is being used as a paradise, as a micro paradise for that tomb. But also, it's very interesting that the garden is not just about outside, but also it's about an image that it provides for the users or for the people who are within the building, whether that building is a palace, is a pavilion, is a kiosk, or in this case is a tomb. So in a way you can see how the garden is being kind of abstracted by this kind of screen. And talking about Humayun's tomb, the next famous garden that we have in Mughal India is Taj Mahal. And the plan is almost the same, but now you can see that the building is moving towards the end of this axis within the garden. But again, many of these ideas are the same. Not only the ideas, but also the elements are the same. And I'm not going to actually go to the details of Persian gardens today, Mughal gardens today, but we know that many masons and architects and designers from Iran, I mean, contemporary nowadays Iran, were involved in this project. So we have a list of people from Samarkand, Shiraz, Isfahan, or even Kashan, who were hired to work in Taj Mahal. And we know that it's like the case of Persepolis, which was also designed as an international project, that all these people brought not only the material but also skills to and contributed to the design of these projects. And it's very interesting to see that in many cases, because we don't have access to real gardens, we have to rely on, again, visual material like carpets. And again, obviously, we know that no carpet was designed based on a plan of a real garden. So we should have, so we should study this visual material within that kind of methodological limit. And it's very interesting that in these garden carpets, in many cases, the pavilion was located in the center of this garden, or in some cases there was a big fountain located there. And again, that kind of matches the archaeological record that we have of some of these gardens. But that plan, the plan of Chaharbagh also continued in different forms, in different gardens or sites in Mughal India. So now we can make some connections between this ivory relief in Assyria, in this Assyrian ivory relief, and Al-Hamra and Humayun's tomb and Bagh Wafa, the Babur's garden in Kabul. So for this part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the use of gardens. And so this first part was more like an introduction to gardens. And now I'm mainly going to talk about medieval gardens. And why am I talking about medieval gardens, and what do I mean by that? Number one, whenever we talk about Persian gardens, mostly we think of the Safavid period or the early modern period, right? So there isn't actually much material on pre-Safavid gardens. Definitely not enough archaeological record. So that's why I thought that for today's lecture, it's better just to talk about medieval gardens that have remained unknown in most history books. So talking about Persian gardens, we usually think about pleasure and fun, drinking, parties, all these fun things that happen inside some of these gardens that have been reflected in, for example, in this tile panel from Metropolitan Art Museum in New York. So many of the main miniature paintings that we have from later periods actually show depict celebrations or parties that occurred in Persian gardens. So this is and we know that many of these miniature paintings are part of some literature books like Shahnameh or like Khamseh. But at the same time, art historians have, in many cases, have been actually trying to find connections between the historical events and these miniature paintings. So in other words, in many of these cases, like for example this one, the miniature painting is referring to specific verses from a specific piece of literature like Shahnameh or Khamseh, but at the same time, it indirectly refers to the historical events of that time, or the patronage, or the stories that have to do with the king or the queen who was behind this artwork. And I intentionally included this image because it's one of the rare images that we have of a garden in the night scene in a garden. That is almost, we don't see it anywhere else. And as you can guess, this painting was done actually when Safavid artists were being becoming more and more familiar with Italian painting. They learned about perspective techniques. So now, as you can see, it's very kind of three-dimensional, which was not common in earlier miniature paintings. So, but in addition to gardens, to the function of the gardens as places for pleasure, we know these days that gardens actually were seen as sources of income. So, for instance, and this is it can be seen when we see, for example, when we read Tavernier, who visited the many gardens actually in Safavid Persia, and he even compared gardens to caravansarais and bazaars. So he said that people are making money, and it's kind of obvious, but in some cases these are pleasure gardens that were being kind of used as sources of income. And we know that many gardens of Samarkand served as sites to sell food and fruits, and we know that some of these gardens were royal gardens, and I'm talking about the 14th century gardens, which is quite interesting because you expect pleasure gardens, especially the royal ones, to be closed, especially to the public, right? And but this is quite interesting. And if we read the medieval documents, we see that gardens were given as bridal gifts or alimony, which is again very interesting. And there have been some recent studies on Mughal gardens, and it shows that many of these Mughal gardens, and some of them don't exist today, but including even, for example, Taj Mahal or Shalimar gardens, they had some economic benefits. So they sold the fruit, and they used that money to kind of to maintain the whole garden. At the same time, many of these gardens were, again, functioned as sites for pleasure and amusement. And by amusement, I mean sometimes they had, for example, Babur refers to some games that they played in Mughal gardens, or, for example, the wrestling, which was a common thing in Mughal gardens. So he sat there and he watched people kind of wrestling there. But also he refers to, and many other actually people refer to the drinking parties inside the garden. What was quite interesting was that in Babur's case, he apparently did fishing in his own gardens, which is very unique. And as you can see here, this is the birthday of Humayun, and they are celebrating that in the middle of a garden. But especially if we remember that many of these gardens were belonged actually to the royal family, to the king or high-rank courtiers. We know that many administrative events happened inside these gardens. So, for instance, we have the administrative affairs in Bad Shadiakh, in Nishabur, or we know that mainly because many of these kings, they kind of lived in these gardens and they moved from one garden to the other one. They had law enforcement happening within these gardens, and that has been also depicted in miniature painting, and I will show it in a few minutes. But also, in some of these gardens, especially in medieval age, in 12th century, 13th century, they were close to hunting parks, so they hunted in these parks and they brought the animals, and then they had royal feasts in the hunted animals, and then they had royal feasts within the gardens. We also have numerous stories of enthronement parties and ceremonies in these gardens, and also the communal prayers that happened inside these gardens. What makes this historical material interesting is that travelers like Chardin, who had access, or member, who had access to some of these gardens and the buildings inside them, they also describe the events that happened within these buildings or within these gardens. And that's very interesting because they provide enormous information on the cultural behavior in the court and what happened there. Clavijo is probably the best source because Clavijo was Spanish ambassador to Timur's court, who visited Timur's gardens, and he provides vivid details of his observations of Timurid gardens, especially in Samarkand, and especially the cultural behavior. And again, why am I talking about cultural behavior? Because we as architects are very interested to see how these spaces within the garden or within these buildings functioned and were used. But also, talking about the administrative meetings, we know that there were some roofed pavilions or kiosks that were designed for the king and his special guests. The garden was widely used to meet and receive ambassadors and rulers from other parts of that empire or from other countries. And for example, as you can see here, this image shows the court of Ulugh Bey. This is a 15th century painting. And look at the geometric patterns of the organization of these carpets, the seating pattern here. And obviously, we see that it may have more to do with the composition of the painting rather than the reality of the behavior or the sitting style within the court. And this is the house of Timur. As you can see here, Timur is sitting in this kiosk in the middle of the garden. And I don't want to actually go to the details of that, but I think this image is very unique, mainly because it shows us how Chinese gardens are starting to influence Persian garden design. So, and as a result, Mughal gardens are more like intersections of these two traditions. And in the background, you can see some rocks which are quite typical of Chinese gardens, but also Chinese garden landscape, Chinese landscape painting. But also the roofed kiosk with a kind of a circulation area that never appeared in any Persian or any Mughal garden. So this is all in painting. And again, these are some images. Mostly, and most of these images have to do or are related to famous texts, like for example, in these two cases are from Khamsa. And as you can see here, they all depict the king sitting in a pavilion or a kiosk observing some events within his court, which is not a building, and in this case is a garden. In my book, and I don't want to talk about it now, but in my book I explain how this became, it was kind of developed as a style of painting which probably didn't have much to do with real gardens. So it was mostly a visual art thing. But here you can see an execution happening right in front of the king's eyes, and some different events, some parties or other things that happened inside gardens. So this is actually one of the other paintings that belongs to that 17th century style of Farangi Sazi that I was talking about, when Safavid painters are kind of being trained and by Italian painters. And as you can see here, there is this kind of this very rigid kind of perspective that has been used as in this painting. But obviously we know that it's not perfect, so they're still learning about perspective techniques. But as you can see here, it's a building in the middle of a garden with a view to mountains. Again, you can see how that is being related to another painting from a totally different concept, right? So the the paintings are totally different from each other in terms of style, but you can see that the same kind of vision is being applied in different types of paintings here. And the fact that the garden and the pavilion is being used as the main context for many of these administrative meetings or gatherings, or the political gatherings. The other thing that is very important to note is that for a long time, actually, this issue remained unstudied, and that was the fact that many of these gardens were used for encampments, and especially considering that many of the owners of these gardens, the kings or the rulers, were nomads. So they always lived like nomads. And they had to, because they were always in war with other rulers or other empires. So that's why they were kind of moving from one area to the other one. So that's why gardens were mainly used as sites for military camps. And it's very interesting that when you start reading many travelers' accounts, you see that when they refer to city, they have a different kind of conception of a city. But when you read the historical accounts, you see that the city is not necessarily referring to a static entity. It's a movable thing. It's something that moves from space, from this side to another side, and that makes sense only when you know that many of these people actually, again, moved from one region to the other region due to geopolitical reasons, as well as sometimes climate and many other things. And it's very interesting that I was reading, I think, one of these texts, and then I realized that Shaybak Khan Shaybani was, his vizier actually asked him what is, he was referring to some cities in the world, some capitals, and he asked him, what is our capital? And he said, my saddle, my horse is my capital. So it's very different conception for a city. But you may ask, how is it related to gardens? Because especially after the 11th century, even in the Ghaznavid age or the Seljuqid era, we know that many of these ordus, the royal encampments, appeared within royal gardens. And for instance, Clavijo, who visited Timur's court and Timur's gardens, he writes that even though Timur has the best palaces in the city of Samarkand, he doesn't like staying in his palaces. He prefers to stay in his gardens that are mostly located outside city walls. It's very interesting. For example, when I was reading Bayhaqi or some other texts, I realized that now in many cases the historian is referring to gardens as signifiers of cities. What does it mean? It means that, for example, if the king was moving from one city to the other, he doesn't refer to the city. He says that the king is moving from Garden of Firuzi, the Bagh Firuzi, to Bagh Shadiyah. So in a way, he expects the audience to understand that he's moving from one region to the other one by referring to the gardens. I personally tried, again, I'm very interested in urban design, so I tried to draw a map, a site plan of an ordu based on the historic material that I read in different texts. And it's very interesting that I realized that it has to do with four main things. Number one, there was this gender segregation in an ordu. And remember that talking about Urdu, I'm not necessarily talking about military encampments. I'm talking about an encampment that included some female as well as male. And there is this social hierarchy that usually the tents of the king and the ruler are located in the center of an Urdu, of a tent city, the most kind of protected area, the best defended area. And obviously it's all about organization and order. Why? Because they had to move just very quickly from one region to the other one. So that's why they needed to pitch tents very quickly. So the organization was very important. But also you see this separation of private, semi-private, and public realms. And you may ask, what is a public realm in an Urdu? It's very interesting that when I was reading Ibn Battuta's text, I realized that he's actually talking about some bazaars and hammam, the bathhouses that were in some of these Urdus, which is very interesting that it was a real city, but it was just movable. So they could move it from one place to the other one. But also, there is some a few texts that provide information about how tents were designed. And usually, actually, when we talk about tents, especially probably my American students may think of a Walmart tent, right? Something very small. But we know that based on, for example, Gharipour's text, some of these tents were as big as a castle. Obviously, we know that it might be some kind of an over-exaggeration of the reality. But it might be right. I mean, the size of these tents could be huge. And as you can see here, it shows the tent and how they are kind of, and we know that some material that was used in the design and the construction of these tents was permanent material. I mean, like for example, that they could use a wooden door in a tent that was made of wool, for example. And the miniature paintings actually provide so much information about what happened within these tent cities or encampments, these Urdus here. And as you can see here, they are having a feast inside this garden. And again, this is a late 16th century painting, so that's why it's kind of more developed. It has a sense of three-dimensionality that you don't see in 15th century paintings, and many of these royal tents were very close to creeks and sources of water, because obviously if you are the king, you expect to be placed in the best location, so with the best view, with shaded areas, plants, flowers, and etc. Okay, so the most probably surprising part of my own studies on gardens was that when I was reading some of these texts, I realized that some of these gardens were not just simply places for encampments, but they were also military sites, which is also very interesting. So we know that many of these gardens, again, served as camps for military, but also they had military expeditions starting from these gardens. So in other words, when they wanted to defend a city, the whole army was placed within the garden as well as outside the garden that was outside the city walls. And this is how they defended the city. And sometimes, and in many cases, it's very interesting that when they wanted to invade a city, the first thing that they did was to invade that garden. So, and when you read all these, especially medieval texts, you see how strategic these gardens were in the politics of this time. Again, this is very different from, it was very different from my own pre-assumption of gardens as places for pleasure, because obviously they were not just simply for places for pleasure anymore, but they were actively used in wars, rebellions, and regional confrontations. And you see that all over the place in all these documents. And even some historians, they talk about the battles that happened inside these gardens and how one group won, and then because they could invade the garden, then they could easily invade the whole city. So winning, conquering a garden was a key thing in a war. And for instance, we have Marco Polo, which talks about some of these gardens that were used as places for preparation of assassins who were being sent to different parts of the empire to kill their enemies, which is, and it's very interesting that he is actually, he refers to them as paradise gardens because people who were being, I can say that probably, being brainwashed in these gardens were in a kind of a micro environment that was quite isolated from the society, and then they were being promised a paradise after their death. So it kind of makes sense that, but you can see how they were being used as places for political reasons. But also, when you study some of these gardens, like for example Taj Mahal or like Humayun's tomb, especially Mughal gardens, you see that there is enormous open space. That doesn't make sense. And there aren't any, enough plants or flowers or trees. And you may ask, why did they need all this open space? And then once you start reading the text that is kind of talking about some of these gardens, you realize that all these open spaces were being used by the army, by the soldiers, by people who were leaving them for a short period of time. But the other thing that I noticed was that in a few cases, there were even references to the watchtowers that existed close to the gardens. So in order to protect the garden, they constructed watchtowers. And so you can see that the garden is, again, is a military site. And that and the military aspects of gardens actually haven't been studied, and I haven't actually read any major piece on this. But also they haven't been depicted in miniature paintings, so that's why probably we didn't know much about these gardens. But the last use of gardens that I want to talk about is the gardens as sites for pilgrimage, and I should give credit to Bayhaqi for teaching me about this use of gardens, because in a story that he has, he's talking about Amir Mahmud, and once he once he passed away, his son, Amir Mas'ud, actually buried him inside the garden of Piruzi, which was Amir Mahmud's royal garden. And it's very interesting that he says that even though this garden was mainly used as a site for pleasure and amusement, after he was buried there, I think in a couple of years, Amir Masud thought that people are having too much fun over there. So that's why he ordered the removal of flowers or plants just to make it look like a mausoleum. So it's a very interesting story because it talks about how a garden as a pleasure site was converted to a mausoleum. And why is it important? Because usually when we talk about mausoleum gardens, we think about Mughal gardens in India. But when we start reading material like, for example, stories that Bayhaqi or some other historians have, we realize that it was an older tradition, but it was not very common. And even, for example, in case of the Bagh Firuzi, the garden of Firuzi, which was Amir Mahmud's garden, he even talks about all these groups of people who were coming to visit his tomb. And then because of that, they constructed some caravansarais and hostels, and and some other urban infrastructure. And this is exactly what we see in the 12th century Ilkhanid cities, because there are 3 cities in the Ilkhanid age that are very important: Ghazaniya, Sultaniya, and Nasriya. And obviously, nowadays we have access to Sultaniya, but the 2 others are not very well studied, and we don't have much archaeological evidence. But we know in these 3 cases, we know that the ruler actually initially converted to Shia, and after a visit to Imam Reza's shrine in Mashhad, and after that he said, I want to have my mausoleum in the middle of this garden. And then, because it was designed as a pilgrimage site, they designed some urban infrastructure, and then gradually the whole city was designed based on this, around this mausoleum, which is very interesting case. Again, unfortunately, we don't have much material evidence, but a couple of Italian travelers provide quite good information on these pastoral cities in northwest Iran. The last instance is Ibn Battuta's to Sadi's tomb, and he also explains that how his tomb was converted to a mausoleum garden in this case. So I know it's not a very happy ending for this lecture, but more detailed information on what I tried to summarize in 35 minutes can be found in my book. And at the end, I would like to wish everyone a wonderful, happy New Year, wonderful Persian New Year.